And in 3, 2, 1, I think we should be live. So you are live on the Contact Centre Network TV. Please do not swear. I am your host, Gary Gormley, and we are talking today about how we can empower more women in the contact centre, and what better way to kick that off with 3 awesome ladies who are a success in their own right in the contact centre. So I'm not going to spend too much time introducing myself, other than to say, if you've not been watching this for the last 5 years, where have you been? But we will move straight into some of the intros. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback on, I think it might be your line, Sandrea. So it just might be a little tweak of your audio. But Jane, say hello to the Contact Centre Network audience and introduce yourself and let them know a little bit about your role as a woman in the contact centre and how you bring some of that to life.
So hello to the Contact Centre Network audience, as requested, Gary. So I'm Jane Redgrave. My job title at Bupa is the Head of Consumer Retention. Part of my role means I'm managing or looking after one of the contact centres of Bupa and working in the insurance side of the business. So that's the day job. But I'm here as well because I'm one of the co-founders of a network that we run at Bupa for our females. We're called Women Taking the Lead, hence the branding on the T-shirt. We created our network around about 2.5 years ago and started as an idea. We took a handful of women that we were mentoring, coaching, who were looking to develop their careers at Bupa, recognised a need to do more in this space, and we've grown a community from what was a handful of women to over 950 now at Bupa. And our aim is all around inspiring, empowering and supporting women and supporting the strategic objectives of Bupa in terms of getting more women to move into more senior roles. So that's what we're all about. And I'm delighted to be here today, Gary. Thank you for.
Well, thank you very much for joining. And it sounds like you're the perfect panelist to spark some debate. Helen, we'll come to you. I'll let you introduce yourself and your role in empowering women in the contact centre.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm hoping that my internet is going to hold up so I can say thank you very much for having me. Yeah, good stuff. I can't really top Jane, so I won't even try. It's great to hear what you're doing there at Bupa, Jane. Amazing initiative. So I am Helen Beaumont Manahan. I am Director of Client Success and CX here at the National Support Network. I've put it under my name there, I think. And yeah, so I come from a long and I'll say checkered contact centre history background in the wonderful world of contact centre QA and the training and development space. And now we look after all things to do with signposting in tricky circumstances for clients in a variety of different industries. And I've just always naturally been a massive advocate of women in the contact centre space. You know, we tend to see where the ceiling is. We've all had those chats kind of offline. And so I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation today. And hopefully, if there's anyone tuning in and thinking about how they can take things forward, then I now work in a female founded organisation and yeah, loving life. So really glad to be part of the conversation.
That's amazing, and another really great introduction there, Helen. So I'm sure you're going to be able to impart some really useful, practical tips into the team today. Sandrea, I will round off the introductions with yourself. I can see you're in like a little phone box style booth, so if you could jump out in your superhero colours.
I wish. Hi everyone, my name is Sandrea Morgan, and I'm really grateful to be here today to have a conversation about empowering women at work, because I know how much it's affected my personal career growth. So I feel really close to this subject in that I know how it's affected my outcomes, and I really want to share my learnings through my years in contact centres. So I've been working in the contact centre in CS space for about 23 years now, so a lot of time, and the learnings along the way have fundamentally been about, you know, how I grow myself as an individual, and then we're facing the same challenges. The other thing that I do is I actually work as well. So this is an area that's close to my heart, and I have lots to share about how I've used my own skills, used career development skills, and my female network, my network of women to grow myself. So lots to share.
Brilliant. And Sandrea, we love what you're saying, and I think it's really great. What I might suggest, just from a network perspective, is maybe toggle your camera on and off, because your sound comes in and out a little bit.
In and out.
And I think,
okay.
Yeah. So maybe just try switching the camera off. It might improve your bandwidth. And we've just lost one of our panelists as well. So I don't want to lose you either. Here we go. We've got Helen back again. Welcome back, Helen. We lost you for a second there, but you're back and you're here.
Back in the room.
So let's dive straight into some of the conversation. And what is good to know is that we are live. So Danny Wareham, who is watching live, has just signposted. So he's popped a comment into the LinkedIn live chat at the bottom to say some of my fave peeps. I wonder, when he says some, which one of us doesn't he include? Thank you very much. If you could drop that into the comments, that would be great. Hopefully it's not me. So we have got some really awesome questions for the panel today, and I'm going to try not to get myself cancelled in any way by asking them in the absolute wrong way. So please take these in the spirit that they're intended, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm out of line. But I think we've got some really interesting topics to tackle. And I've worked in the contact center for a lot of years, and some of my most inspirational people have been the women that I've worked with, that I've learned so much from. And it is a very female dominated industry, I think. But where I think some of the limitations seem to come from is when you see people around that senior table and taking on stronger, more executive roles within the contact center. So that's one of the things that we want to tackle today. We want to talk about maybe some of those biases that maybe there is in leadership. So I'm going to start and aim this one at you, Helen, if I can, and then I'll offer to each of the other panelists just around maybe what some of the gender biases are in leadership in perception. So the traditional kind of leadership model, I suppose, in contact centers might unintentionally favor male traits such as maybe assertiveness over perhaps collaboration. How do you think, maybe thinking about those biases, we need to rebalance how we define effective leadership? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you kind of touched on it there. I think one of the most persistent biases that I've observed showing up is how ambition and leadership get read differently depending on your gender. So if a man, like you said, speaks up, he's seen as confident, but as a woman, you might be seen as pushy. So men potentially get promoted on that potential, you know, he can grow into it, but women get promoted only on proven delivery. So even your tone of voice, you know, your body language gets judged through that lens, and we all do it, even as women. You know, we've all kind of been steeped in the culture. So I think the solution isn't really about telling women to adapt or to flex. It's about really looking from a systemic level. Can we change the system? So can we make sure that promotion material, you know, what you need to do, the criteria to get promoted is explicit and it's measurable? And also, you know, I mentioned bias there. Are we training panels, recruitment panels on bias? And crucially, are we then looking at decisions that have been made? Are we auditing those? I told you I'd bring a QA lens to this. So I think if the data is showing us that men in our organizations are consistently being promoted faster, then potentially that there's a process that needs to be looked at there. So transparency, accountability, making sure we're breaking bias, and really being aware of our biases at an individual level.
And Jane, I think Helen makes some really good points there, but do you, from your perspective, and I suppose the time that you've been in business, do you think there is a double standard we see of females and male counterparts?
I think so. What do I see? So I think what I see is women who tend to hold back because maybe they don't want to be perceived in a particular way. So now, whether that's the environment and the system that causes that, or whether that's something internal, I think is probably up for debate and might depend on the person or that sort of circumstance. but I do see women holding back and not putting themselves forward. I think things like you know, examples, and I'm sure there's research out there around women that ask for pay rises, or, you know, kind of where they set their expectations in terms of salary, whereas, you know, you kind of hear that men are much more forthright in terms of those conversations, much less likely to undervalue themselves. So I think there's something about how do we encourage women to step into those conversations, but then again create the environment where it feels safe to step into those conversations. You know, one of the things that I've been working on kind of recently, if I can sort of share a personal kind of experience, is actually showing up much more confident. So kind of that outward self-belief and showing that and using sort of language that reflects that. So, you know, I know I'm good, and actually, you know, you need to know I'm good as well, and not being afraid to actually say that, and that kind of practicing that coming out of your mouth and starting to get really comfortable with, I know the value, I know my value, I know what I'm worth. But I think you have to practice that. I think you have to get confident with it. And I think if you're not confident, you know, saying it to whether it's with, actually, I'm really good at what I do, and you know, kind of I do add value. So so yeah, I don't know if there is a double standard necessarily, but I do see women holding themselves back, whereas men, I feel, don't tend to. And that's really generalist. I'm sure there are women that are different and men that are different, but
so let me just explore that point that you've just made there, Jane, because I think there's probably a lot of women that are listening to this and resonating with that story. What are some of the steps that you took to gain that self-confidence, that self-awareness, that allowed you to be able to have those maybe bold and more difficult conversations?
So I'm going to say two things, right? So I started with the introduction talking about the network that we created at Bupa, which is a community. One, I think the power of a network and a community, and having similar people with similar experiences around you in itself, is really empowering. You know, you've got someone who's cheerleading you, who's telling you how good you are, and actually the community that we created at Bupa, I'm really proud to be part of that community and kind of leading the way in that space, and kind of hear stories every day about that power. So I think finding a community, finding a network, and getting that from others. But then the second thing, and again, Gary, I don't know if I've kind of shared this with you, but I've recently qualified as a coach. So I'm a accredited coach, and I'm a massive fan of coaching, and actually have an exec coach at the moment. And I think the power and the transformation that comes from investing in your own development and taking time to, I guess, sort of dive into where those insecurities come from and explore that and start to challenge some of those insecurities. So yeah, I'm working with a coach, and I would recommend to anybody, if you can, grab hold of some coaching. You know, and you know, for me, it's sort of, as I say, been transformational.
And similar approach there for you, Helen. I mean, you're the National Support Network, that community and that sense of belonging as a group. What are you seeing from the conversations that you're having across the network that you see?
I'm just really interested actually in what Jane said there about coaching. I think she's absolutely right. And I do wonder if there's more we could do as women to maybe set up these communities, the coaching communities, and make sure that in our organisations we're having those conversations. And I also know, Jane, like me, I'm recently I've recently certified as an I Am Remarkable facilitator, and I know, Jane, you do that too. But that's all about the power of network, and also to just check back in with what Jane said about advocating for yourself, showing up in that way, you know, acting as if, and really knowing your worth. That I Am Remarkable movement's really important as well. So yeah, I think the network, the power of community is absolutely where it's at, and we shouldn't just sit back and wait for other people to do it. We should take the lead there and get on with it ourselves.
And we've got Sandrea back now, so I'm going to ask you a question, Sandrea, because I know when we were preparing this, there was some real key topics just around I suppose the succession planning, the identification of skills in women, and mapping those talents against people that are right for the next role. What's your thoughts on how we do that in leadership to maybe bring more people or more women specifically forward in being identified as the right candidates for particular roles?
So I think there's a need to get clear on what strengths look like in leadership roles and how they can show up differently within genders. And if as a leadership team, as you're looking for the people who are ready to progress, the people who you're going to promote, that you're not highlighting behaviours that kind of show up in one gender above another. So in terms of how I kind of deal with that and how I support women internally is to really just look at personal development and helping people to understand their values. So it's a values proposition exercise where you go, right, what are the strengths that you bring? What experiences do you bring? How do you add value? What have you always had as an individual? So you get clear about who you are and what you bring to the table so that you can more confidently have those conversations about progression. So I'm very clear that within my teams, people know what roles would work for them. How does it play to their personal strengths? Because as women and anyone really progressing within your career, it can be really easy to just look at the role above you without going, actually, what is the place that would be the right fit for me? How will I thrive? How will I grow? Where can I add the most value? Because those are the interviews and those are the conversations in which you're really going to be able to fly, because you're so clear in those conversations about your individual value. You're easily able to really connect with the role and pitch yourself for that position in comparison to somebody who's just going at it through a lens of, oh, I'm just ready for a step up, or I'm just looking for a different thing. You're looking at that role going, I can bring the most to this opportunity. And it is about the business recognizing that, you know, we're not cookie cutters. You're very rarely going to have a person who's the perfect fit. But if you can see that those strengths and you can see that that person is able to be the right fit for that role in terms of filling that position, you will do the right thing in the end.
Yeah. And I think we've talked about, certainly from an external perspective, anonymizing CVs and kind of looking at the CV on its merits. I think there's a challenge internally, I suppose, when you are an internal candidate vying for a role that is either a senior role or an exec role, and then being benchmarked against others that might be male, might be female. But how do we, I suppose, make that distinction, Sandrea, around the value that an internal candidate brings and their value versus maybe someone who's external that isn't necessarily proven internally but has a nice shiny CV? How do we tackle that one?
I think it's about focusing on the work and the outcomes that you expect to be delivered in the role. And with an internal candidate, they bring the experience of knowing the organisation. And if you can tie that with actually they're growing in the role, they're bringing the experience of the business. External candidates can be shiny, but if it's a lot easier to tweak an internal candidate and give them some additional training, which is something is also our responsibility. Give them some additional training to really help them bridge that small gap, because we can look for perfection, but let's be honest with ourselves, that doesn't exist. There's no one who is perfect in their role. So if you're looking through a lens of, I'm bringing in an external person who brings everything, that's fairly unlikely to be true. So if you're looking at internal candidates, you know their history, you know how much they've grown already. They might still have things that you need to address, but normally there is training that you can deliver and steps that you can take as a business to go, I'm investing in Helen, because I can see that Helen is 95% there, and that 5% might be actually, they might not be confident doing presentations, but actually that's a skill that you need to grow and you can help people learn. Or they're not great at building reports. Again, it's not something that everyone's confident to do, but those are things that you can train and develop. So with internal candidates, I think there's a need to just look at the gap and go, is this something that's big enough to not give this person an opportunity? And if you take that step, a lot of the times you can give them a chance. And that's what you have probation periods for. That's why you set clear KPIs. It works.
And whilst
we're back to coaching as well, aren't we?
What, Helen? We are back to coaching.
Sorry, I was just going to say we're back. Yeah, back to that coaching conversation. So yeah, so if we have that strong network of coaching, and that's kind of part of the conversation, then exactly like Sandrea just outlined, that's where that's the stretch. We identify that, and then you work with your coach to get there from an internal perspective, rather than having to always look externally for the new and shiny thing.
New and shiny best next thing, which sometimes doesn't always pan out. We do have, though, and I think when I've seen countless debates of this on various chat shows, Question Time, and around the pay inequalities that exist between those in leadership roles that are male and those that are in leadership roles that are female, and doing essentially the same job, but having pay inequity. Do you guys believe, and I'll start with you on this one, Helen, do you believe that we are in an environment where that's still happening? And what would your advice be for organizations or for people that are tackling that price or that salary conversation when they're going for new roles?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak with any great authority about how that looks. I do know that the younger generations are now really bucking the trend by just posting their salaries online, just being completely radically honest about what's going on, which is quite interesting. And I definitely think the first step to tackling any issues is not vulnerability, it's visibility, isn't it? So if we're definitely publishing pay bands, but also making it clear how progression works as well, and make sure that we're all in our organizations committed, I think, to having open conversations around salary. And again, we're back to what Jane was saying about maybe asking for what our worth is, but it starts with knowing our worth, right? But our organization has to make it easy to know it. So when we're doing that and we're kind of removing the mystery around salary, I think then we could start to maybe see transparency around pay as less of a risk and more of a route to trust ultimately.
And Jane, you talked about this earlier, and I'll come to you on this point. Is you talked about knowing your worth and not being afraid to ask. And I think it might be applied to anybody, but when asking for a pay review or a salary review, there is a nervousness potentially in that. Do you think that nervousness is more prevalent in women who are asking for pay rises, or do you think that's more unilateral across any gender?
Oh, this is interesting, Gary. I was having this conversation actually just yesterday with somebody in the office. So, and that person was a male. And I was encouraging them to do exactly what you just described, and they were like, "Oh no, I'm just happy to have a job," and don't want to rock the boat, and So I think it's probably there for both genders. I think again, my own personal experience. I asked for a sort of role regrade last year, a couple of years ago. And it was really awkward, to kind of just go, feel like, the work I'm doing is probably worth kind of a look at. And I just remember the whole thing just being really awkward. I also remember it took quite a long time, and I kind of just let it slide, kind of thinking, well, maybe they didn't think it's a good idea. And, I won't kind of chase it or ask again. And, it's a sort of holding back. I'm going to guess that's, some of the guys will be the same, some women will be the same. But I think the fact that we've got a gender pay gap still shows that we've still got an issue. I think talk about it from a different sort of lens and different perspective, maybe, is also as a leader, when you're recruiting, not undervaluing the worth of the person that's in front of you. And I think that internal external is quite interesting. We in my experience, we tend to undervalue internal over external. It feels like if you go external, then you're going to pay a bit more to kind of bring that talent in. And again, as opposed to investing in the internal talent. So I think as leaders, we need to kind of change that and change sort of the approach to that, and really start to put a price and a value on that experience that maybe we don't always do. So yeah, I don't know if it's, I mean, there is a gender pay gap. We know that. I think exactly echo what Helen said in terms of visibility. The fact that we talk about it, the fact that firms now publish their kind of pay gap reports means that we've got that kind of visibility. But it is still there, right? And so the fact that it's still there shows that we've still got work to do.
And I think more specifically when there is a gender pay gap in roles that are equal, in that I do a leadership role, you do a leadership role, why should we be paid any less, more, or different? So I think there's a real challenge there in, if the role is the same, why is there such a difference, unless it's based on experience? Sandrea, I'm really interested in your perspective about how women can negotiate on the offer, and what their experience and your experience might be across that when kind of given a salary or given an offer. How do you make that conversation an easier one to negotiate from?
So for me, because there's two things I think to answer in this question. Negotiation, really understanding your value from the off. It's really easy to just accept what's offered because you're just so excited to get the role. But actually, if you look at that job spec, you look at that business and you know, I'm going to be able to add value. And as a contact center leader, we are saving costs. We are building the brand. We are the face of the brand for a lot of customers. And so if you're leading that team and you know you're able to bring change, use your network, get clear on what you should be paid for that role based on the size of the team, complexity of the role, what you're going to deliver, and push. Because normally the business is going to offer you the least that it can, because businesses want to be profitable, right? But if you push back, I would say 9 out of 10 times, you're going to get something. You might not get all of what you asked for. So I would always say, ask for a little bit more than what you expect to get and what you believe is reasonable. And generally, they will come and meet you, if not in the middle, a little bit above. And it works almost every time. It's the same as if you're at the market on a Saturday. It's a little bit of a haggle, but know your worth and know the value that you're going to bring in a role, and it does make a difference. I'd also say when you're internal, it's absolutely essential to be consistently measuring your work and how you are adding value to the business, so that when you do come to having those conversations about progression or promotion or a pay rise, you can line up what you've delivered versus a business metric. It might be how much you've saved, how much revenue you've generated, how you've coached and developed other colleagues who have progressed. Be able to be clear by reviewing and reflecting yourself either on a weekly or a monthly basis. Sit down with the business KPIs and the business objectives and go, how have I delivered versus these things? So that when you do go into that conversation, you're not on the back foot. You're not asking for anything you haven't earned. You're really clear about the value that you're adding, because it changes how you approach that conversation. It changes how you carry yourself in that conversation if you're clear about what you've delivered and how much you've been able to affect the business and the customer and your teams.
Yeah, and you know what, this brings me on to a really interesting point about behavioral bias, and maybe the behaviors that male colleagues demonstrate, and how they are perceived when they demonstrate those versus how a female colleague might be perceived if they demonstrated the same behaviors. And we already touched on this slightly at the start, Helen, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on maybe the unconscious biases within the organization that might be affecting how performance, ambition, or leadership capability is perceived differently between male and female leaders and colleagues. So what's your thoughts on that? Do you think there are unconscious biases influencing our decisions around or our perceptions of people's performance relative to gender?
Well, I'd love to say no. I'd love to be like, no, everything's fine. But if we look at, like Jane mentioned, the gender pay gap, it is still there, and it's not going to close for a very, very long time. So I have to say, yes, even in the most lovely and well-meaning organisations, I definitely think that there is, we have biases for a reason. They're unconscious biases, yeah. So that thought that men might get promoted on potential and women on proof, I think does still exist. And it's not about, like I said earlier, like fixing women or like coaching them to like lean in and be more like men, you know, be more man. It's about maybe redesigning the process and making sure that people know exactly what it is. I love what Sandrea was saying there about just kind of thinking about, well, what is the value I'm bringing? And then to Jane's earlier point, can we make sure that we're then empowered enough to speak up, even if it's going to be an awkward conversation, and say, look, I've done X, Y, and Z, and this is how I've embodied the values in my way, rather than just trying to get them to fit into some kind of mold.
Yeah, and Jane, what's your thoughts on that? Because I know in a lot of organizations, and Bupa is a really good example, there've been some really I mean, there's been a lot of CEOs that are female. How do you think the perception and the behaviors and the biases come out to play in larger scale organizations?
I would just say we've got some great female leaders at Bupa. I work in the insurance side of the business, which is more traditional in terms of the gender that sits at the top table. It's much more sort of male dominated, I guess, as much sort of, you know, insurance firms are. But in our care services business, in our provision business, more the sort of hands-on business, I guess, you kind of see kind of women leading and having a fantastic impact and making a fantastic difference. I think you said there, Helen, around sort of changing the system. I think we very much do try and focus on the women and fixing the women and, you know, getting them to conform. And I think it's maybe a bit of both that we need to do. So, you know, I think we do need to empower women. We do need to instill confidence. But what we can't do is run these amazing sort of courses where you take a group of women away for a week, put them through a course, and then they come back and they're in the same environment. So you kind of have to do both. And I think, Gary, we'll come on and talk about sort of allyship, sponsorship, kind of male allies. I think for me, there's something in that says, well, how do we get our kind of male allies engaged in the conversation? How do we get their ears? How do we get their sponsorship, their support? And actually, I think then you stand a chance of starting to sort of change the system, if you like. But I think that's harder to do. I was at an event last week, and this was a sort of race and ethnicity event that Bupa were hosting or running, and there's a guest speaker there, and she talked about something called the groundwater research, and it was where she talked about that you tinker with the fish. So in this circumstance, our scenario, the women are the fish, but actually, if you don't change the pond that they're in, then the fish will never thrive. So ultimately, it's about changing both. And neither are easy, I think, but you can't do one without the other.
I think there's a really good point, and I think there's probably, I mean, people might have seen it. It's around. There's a Taylor Swift interview where she's asked about how the music industry favors males over females, and she says if a guy is bold and outspoken, it's a real plus, but if a woman is bold and outspoken, she's seen to be a trouble causer. I think that there could still be an overhang within that. Do you think that exists in the contact center world still, Helen? Do you think that kind of that I suppose that misalignment is still apparent in today's contact center environments?
I wouldn't want to generalize, but in my own limited experience, so N equals 1 experience, yes, it has. Certainly, I'm talking about my own career here. I've definitely been, I've experienced that for sure. And it makes me think about what we were talking earlier about the kind of descriptors that we use for men. And, you know, if a man shows leadership, a woman's just being bossy or pushy. It made me think about the studies that they've done where they've sent gender neutral CVs in rather than ones with like overtly feminine versus overtly masculine names on them, forenames, and just seeing the difference in the way that the perception is based on, you know, whether it's clear that it's a woman or a man applying for the role. So yeah, I think the answer is I can't, you know, possibly know everywhere, and I'm sure there are more progressive places than others, but it is still alive and biting out there in the world, I believe, in the contact centre world, yes.
And you know what, I think it leads into a question that's come from the audience from Catherine around how do we start to create those inclusive workplace cultures where women feel valued and heard. So Sandrea, I'm just going to ask you to kind of bring yourself off mute and maybe share your thoughts on Catherine's question in the chat.
So how do you create inclusive workplace culture where women feel valued and heard? I think, so for me, I'd say make communication and feedback and open conversation a fundamental part of your culture. And there's different ways to do that. So we're always talking about the work, we're always giving each other positive feedback when we see it. So we're really specific about how that colleague added value, but we're also really constructive when we want to give constructive feedback. So cultures where we're constantly talking about work and giving each other feedback about what's going well, either in terms of how we're doing the work or the delivery itself, tend to be more open because you're focused on the things that really matter. But also, I think as leaders, we have to make sure everyone has a voice. So if you're in a team meeting and you can see that some colleagues are not speaking up, encourage them to do that without making it feel like you're putting pressure on them. But you can lead a meeting in a way where you're making sure that everyone's included. Some people are more confident to speak in meetings, but if you can see that a colleague is not speaking up, reach out to them after. We just had a conversation about A, B, and C. I know this is something you care about. Is there something you want to engage with? So really make sure that you're close enough to your team to understand who your people are, because not everybody feels comfortable to be vocal. Make sure you're creating space for everybody to be able to share how they're feeling in different ways.
And Helen, thinking about that question there from Kate, I mean, you've worked in a number of organisations and you've done a lot of work on culture in organisations. What's your take on how we can create those inclusive cultures where people feel valued?
Yeah, I think just to kind of riff on what Sandrea was saying there, really, it's about us all to make sure that we recognise that not everybody is going to feel confident to speak up and be, bold and brash in those more public settings. So just to carve out the space, exactly like Sandrea said, really, make sure that people have the forum. And it might just be that there's a different channel where they feel more able to have a voice. So if we've got particular like online threads or something where people can feel like they contribute and then make sure that they get that positive feedback, that could be a way to just engage them in the conversation and make sure their voices are being heard.
And Jane, from your point of view and some of the stuff that you're working on at Bupa, how are you bringing that inclusive workplace culture alive in your organisation?
So I was going to I guess, talk about some of the power of storytelling. So we've not sort of touched on that yet, but actually kind of creating spaces where people can share their own stories, and particularly women, particularly females that have been promoted, have had opportunities. And I think for me, I very much believe that if you can see others doing it, then it kind of just makes everything a bit more reachable and a bit more achievable. I mean, there's the old, I started on the phones and look at me now kind of, message that's out there. Everybody seems to have started in the contact centre. But I think actually showing what's possible is really, 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 really important and really, really empowering. So, yeah, I think that the power of storytelling, I think talking about these topics, sort of talking about inclusivity, why it's important, why it matters. So actually sort of keeping that sort of front of mind and that being a topic. So when we induct people into our business, making sure that they understand the sort of environment they're coming into, what behaviours that means that they can expect to see and therefore will demonstrate, and I guess kind of just always talking about it so that people always understand the expectations, a sort of zero tolerance approach to any sort of discrimination or anything or sort of that goes against that. And I think making sure that people call that out if they see it as well, not sort of walking past things or turning a blind eye to things.
Yeah. I'm going to stick with you, Helen, because I've got another question. In fact, stick with you, Jane, because I've got another question. And I suppose some women in business might steer away from moving into more senior roles or exec roles because they feel like there might be a trade-off between I can't be a mother or a carer and have a career at the same time. And I think maybe people feel forced to choose between one or the other. What do you think contact centres can do to support people with those parental responsibilities or caring responsibilities and still enable them to have career growth and feel like they're being stunted because they feel like there's a choice to be made? What's your experience and thoughts on that, Jane?
So I'd start by saying that this is one of our number one topics that we talk about in our women's community. It is the number one thing that I think if we could kind of find the solution, you know, the magic bullet, whatever it is, it's the one thing that is really sort of topical. I think for a number of reasons, right? So I think, you know, those women who there's lots of different scenarios. Some women who come back to work after having children have that mum guilt of, you know, kind of chasing a career rather than spending it with their families. We've got kind of real examples of women that have chosen not to have children and how they're judged in the workplace. So that stigma that comes from the fact that you've chosen not to become a parent for whatever reason, or that you can't become a parent, that might be. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you know, when you start to get sort of elderly parents maybe, and you've got caring responsibilities and how that impacts work. So I think there's loads of different scenarios here. And I think the key is, for me, around flexibility and creating opportunities for whatever it is that's right for what women need, if you like. So, and I don't think that's easy to do. So one of the sort of things that we talk about a lot is that quite a lot of our women sort of middle management, you know, kind of looking for next roles, next progression. But actually there aren't part-time or flexible jobs when you start to go up. So actually when you look at the most senior of roles, so, you know, how many part-time CEOs do you see? How many job share CEO roles do you see? Or even, you know, come down a layer. So the higher you get, I think the less flexibility there seems to be, or there's less visible flexibility. So I think it's on all of us to say, well, how do we create that? How do we create those opportunities that open up different ways of working? I was on a webinar the other day, and someone talked about a firm where they had worked, where there was a job share register that people could go on to. So it was held by HR. You could register your interest in a job share, and actually then when roles were coming up that you were interested in, you could look at the job share register, and you know, which sounds amazing, doesn't it? You just think, imagine if you had access to something like that. I think it'd be quite difficult to do. But we've got to find a way to, because otherwise you will always suppress the talent. We'll always create this gender pay gap, because women will have children, they will have families, and there's nothing wrong with being a mum and saying that's my priority right now, and we need to make that okay for women as well. So you know, just because you're not ambitious right now with a baby and a 3-year-old doesn't mean that you're never going to be ambitious. And again, we've got to kind of be comfortable with saying, I am ambitious, but at the moment I just need to pause while I deal with this part of, you know, what's going on in life.
And I mean, it's really interesting. You said something there. You say that women are maybe judged by other women for not wanting to have children and have a career. I don't believe that same judgment would come to a male. And I've said for a long time that I'm not a dad figure. I'd probably make a great dad, but I don't want kids, and it's never been on my life plan. But nobody really, I feel more females judge me for not wanting it than any of my male mates or colleagues would say, right, oh, good decision, they often say. Why do you think that peer-to-peer and female-to-female judgment is so prevalent?
It's a really interesting question, and maybe it just goes back to unconscious bias. You know, maybe that's where it stems and that's where it starts. And you know, I think there are more younger people who are choosing not to have children, so maybe it's a generational you know, kind of thing. And actually, as our kind of younger people kind of come into the workplace and become this new generation of people that are sort of choosing, and there's, you know, that's more prevalent. I mean, I even made the mistake the other day. I was in work and I was getting a coffee, and a guy was getting a coffee that I'd not seen before, and we got chatting, and he was talking about the fact that I think he's got something like 3 sort of teenage sort of children, But he's kind of been divorced. So I was like, oh, okay, do they live with your wife? You know, and I stepped straight into that. And he was like, no, they live with me. And it was just like, oh, wow, how did I stepped straight into that? And I believe I'm sort of pretty tuned into, you know, kind of the right things to say, particularly kind of around those sort of topics. But yeah, I did exactly that. And it was really interesting. His reaction, he was like, you know, don't worry about it. He's like, that's the reaction that happens. He says, people look at me when I leave work to go and pick my children up from school. He said, I feel like I'm judged as a man for, you know, kind of doing that. So yeah, I can only think, yeah, that unconscious bias. And as I say, I stepped straight into that myself.
Yeah. And I think there's a couple of other elements to it, because we often think about this as having to, the mother stays at home with the children type of thing. But actually, I think there's the aspect of, if there is family trauma or carers, that role and that responsibility sits sometimes squarely with the woman of the household, or the caregiver role becomes naturally, oh, it must be my wife that does that, or my partner does that. Sandrea, what's your thoughts on the role of, I suppose, the caregiver and the caring responsibilities in limiting potential growth of females in business?
I think it certainly plays a part, and it has done for a very long time. But I think one of my learnings over the last few years post-COVID is around that element of people being able to deliver without being physically present in a location. And so, as somebody with elderly parents, I do have additional responsibilities from that perspective. But when I've needed to, my employer has been really flexible around that, and I've been able to take the time I need. But you kind of originally approach this question through the lens of somebody looking at progression, looking at promotion into those CEO, senior leadership roles. I think you never lose anything from asking. If you're down to like the final two, or you've just been made an offer, that business wants you. And you're a whole person who brings a life outside of work. And sometimes it's just about being able to comfortably say, I can do this job in 4 days. Or I can do this job between, I will wake up and do an hour before I leave, take some time with my kids, come in, go pick them up. Because you're going to be measured on outcomes in that role. Nobody's going to worry about how you do it. What they should be worrying about is what your outcomes are. And if you could show that actually I will be able to deliver in this role, if you're the right person, most businesses, I think in this day and age, will go, okay, you're still the right person. So feel the way we talked about earlier about feeling comfortable to ask for a bit of more money potentially and a better package. Part of your package is your flexibility if you have caring needs. So have to be comfortable to say what you need to do for your kids, or for, in my case, it would be my parents.
And this isn't, I suppose, just limited to the outcomes and the work that you do in the 9 to 5. It's also that challenging that second shift at home mentality, isn't it, Helen? So if I was to think about how women in business balance those two things, and the expectation of you finish your 9 to 5 and then you come home and you look after the kids, you put the food on, all of those things that traditionally you would assume or are sometimes stereotyped as the role of women in the home. How do we challenge that norm of not having to be doing two jobs at the same time because of your gender?
Yeah, I was really resonating with what Sandrea was saying there about, caring for elderly parents. That's kind of part of my reality, as well as having kids as well, although they are getting older now. But you're absolutely right. It's really real. So all the caring, the admin, the household labour, it does often fall disproportionately to women, not in every household, of course, but that leaves less energy for like networking, for those kind of stretch projects at work, or even frankly, above performance. So the career can take a backseat because, of course, home's where the heart is, right? Your family should come first, but when you're left with that skewed balance, it is important for workplaces, I think, to at least recognise that, because we can't be responsible for who's loading the dishwasher at home, right? But we can think about how we design our policies and our recognition, kind of accommodate for that. And like Jane said, wouldn't it be great if we could normalise job sharing, even at more senior roles? I'm not quite sure how that would work in practice, but brilliant. But certainly, like Sandrea was saying, compressed hours. And asynchronous progression routes. So the idea that just because you take a career break to raise a young family doesn't mean. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that she got made redundant from a 16-year career while she was on maternity leave, and it happens so often, right? So that's structural. So we need a culture, I think, that acknowledges that we have competing loads, and that is often, something that women will experience more in the workforce. And when we acknowledge that, then there's wins for the organisation too.
And I'm going to come to you, Jane, with this next question, because it kind of leads on naturally, I think, from some of the conversations that we've had there around the role of women in business and the dual roles that might kind of follow with a home life, and then the lack of maybe recognition internally from perhaps male counterparts around that duality of life. And then you mentioned it earlier, because it kind of leads on, is to say, how do we tap into those colleagues in the workplace that are men and get them on board as allies and soundboards, and help them understand the breadth of what a female leader is required to do versus maybe that of a male counterpart? How do we get more men to lean in and listen?
Oh, that's such a good question. This is, again, something that we talk a lot about in our network and is kind of on our list of priorities of things that we want to tackle and to look at. We're really lucky. We've got some really great sponsors for the women's network. We've got some great male allies. However, have we got enough? No. Have we, when we've sort of talked about this topic as a topic and gone in front of sort of senior men and said we're looking for more allyship, we get really positive responses, right? So when you kind of say we want more male allies, we want people to lean into this topic, everybody nods and everybody says, great, yes, we absolutely need to. And then people ask what they want you, what you want them to do. And I think then you kind of go, oh, okay, so what is it that we're asking for? Because I think if you ask most males, they will say that they are male allies, that they are supportive, that they do understand it and they do get it. So I think we talk about this difference between passive versus active. So I think there's something about, actually, as a male ally, are you active in that space or are you passive? And it's moving from inaction or, that passive kind of approach to a more active approach. So making sure that you are knocking on the door to say, how can I help? What is it that you need from me? Making sure that you're in the room sponsoring initiatives, sponsoring females in your structure, your direct reports, thinking about opportunities and the females that you work with and whether those opportunities would be a good match. So, and that's not to say to discount opportunities for men but actually sort of forefront of your mind, are there women or females that I work with that I see this as a good opportunity? I was having a think, Gary. I saw your post last night on LinkedIn. It really, I woke up this morning thinking about it, and you shouted out kind of women that you'd worked with, and thank you for the shout out. The kind of that you saw as in this space. And I was thinking about who's given me that kind of sponsorship or leg up in the business, and who's helped my career. And as I thought about it. And this is going to, sadly, when I thought about it, the people that sprung to mind are the women. It's been the women that have been sponsoring me. My first kind of leadership role was a woman who kind of said to me, let me help you become, it was an STM at the time, let me work with you to get an STM role. And then my second jump was my CSM went on maternity leave. And she said, Jane, I really want you to cover my mat leave. So, when it comes up, apply for it. You've got my back, you've got my back in, and it's you. I want you to look after my team. And I can think of a few women kind of in that space. When I try and think sadly, when I try and think of male leaders that have done that, I struggle to actually go, well, where have been the men that have done that in my career? So yeah, I think doing more of that, sponsoring, thinking about the females that you work with and kind of nodding them, giving them the confidence and kind of saying to them, come on, you can do this, you can, because we know that women hold themselves back and they lack self-belief. So how do we kind of show them that they're worth it? Sorry, I was on a bit.
No, I thought there was some really great points there, and Helen, I saw you nodding to a lot of what Jane was saying there. So that really sounds like it resonated. What are some of the key things that you think some of our and your male counterparts can do to help accelerate the growth of women in leadership?
I was nodding along to what Jane said, because she mentioned like being active as well as passive, and I saw this the other day online, and it said ally is a verb and a noun. And so it's fine to say, oh yeah, I'm an ally, or however you want to say it, but actually it's something else to actively notice whose voice is getting talked over in a meeting, maybe like Sandrea said, carving out the way to intervene maybe later. It's about, I mentioned stretch roles earlier, it's about sponsoring women, backing women, like Jane said, you can do this, not just kind of like like waving a flag from the sidelines. So we're using our positional power, be we women in senior roles or men, to challenge that bias, the promotion decisions or whatever that looks like. Unlike Jane, I've been very lucky in my career to have had some really strong male allies that have really backed me and given me help. They literally, because of what I was doing and who I was, not because of my sex or my gender, if we want to differentiate between the two. So I have been lucky enough to have seen what good male allyship looks like. And incidentally, those people don't shy away from the word feminist either. They call themselves feminists. So it's been great to see from a personal perspective.
Yeah, and I think I'll be honest with my feelings about running this as a webinar and being a male hosting it as a webinar. Like, does that sit right? Will I be judged as being a male speaking to 3 really successful females about how do we empower more women in the contact center? But then I thought, actually, you know what? It takes someone like myself, and whether you're male or female, just to have the conversation and force the topic. So that's
allyship, Gary. That's you demonstrating active allyship. Perfect.
Can I just
Sandrea,
ask though? So that's really sorry. I just very quickly to pick up on what you just said. Did you feel like a bit of a pull there? Like, oh, am I going to be judged for this? Is that what you're saying? You actually experienced that?
A little bit. Yeah, it's like, and it was like almost like, is it my place to be running this as a topic and hosting it as a male? But maybe that's just me in my head. But absolutely allyship, Jane. So I'm totally with you on that. Sandrea, any thoughts on what men in the workplace can do to help develop and build that level of allyship that Jane was referring to earlier?
Yeah, so I echo Jane when we say it's absolute allyship. You coming up with this webinar is something we should be talking about. So my view, and I have been really lucky, like Helen, to have men in my career who have supported, championed, and helped me grow and develop. And they've been active with it. So it goes back to that element of spotting talent. Yes, gender comes into this, because we're talking about it, but spotting talent, encouraging the right behaviors, telling you where you need to grow, being your face in the rooms that you aren't, and being comfortable to do that, and having an organizational culture where that is okay. Because sometimes I think we're in a space, to your angst about doing this webinar, for example, sometimes people don't feel like they can. So I think it's important for organizations to be clear that yes, it's okay for you to have a woman in your team who you're pushing, because she won't push herself. So you need to be her champion in the space that when she's not there. And I definitely have had people in my career who've been that person for me.
Absolutely. We are approaching the top of the hour, so I've got one final question for all of you as panelists. If there was one bold change that we needed to make to accelerate the change and develop the progression for women in the contact center, what would be your top tip? I'll come to you first, Jane. I'll let you take yourself off mute. and then it gives the other guys an opportunity to think. But what would be your one top tip?
So my one top tip would have to be around creating those. We've got to find this way to create those more flexible roles at the top, and that's about the system. That's not about fixing the women. It's about changing the system.
Change the system. Vive la France. Helen, for yourself.
Yeah. So along with
part of the revolution.
Yeah, woo. So along with what Jane said, I would definitely say, because I think that's very important as well, it's systemic that it needs to happen at. But for women, don't wait until you are perfectly ready and you've got everything all lined up and in a row. So we know that men will apply when they're, not quite ready. Women, they have to be nearly 100% or overly confident. But apply. Life happens when you're in the room, not when you're kind of knocking at the door. So go for it.
Be in the room. Love it. Sandrea, final thought from yourself.
Create a organizational culture where people are measuring their success and reflecting and understanding the value that they bring, so they are more comfortable having those conversations about why they should be the one who's promoted, why they should have that role, why they should have that pay rise, because they will know their worth and be able to discuss it confidently.
Fantastic. And I think the final comment that I've just shared there from LinkedIn user, whoever you are, thank you very much for tuning in. Really great discussion. There is a lot to do. So systemically, company culture, HR laws, and society needs to kind of challenge the way that we the way that we approach this in business or in the contact center. So I've really enjoyed that discussion. Thank you very much, Jane, Helen, and Sandrea, for all of the time that's gone into prepare for this, and for giving your time up today to have this discussion. I think it's been a really important discussion to have. Thank you to everybody that has tuned in on the live feed through LinkedIn Live. And if you are going to watch this back in replay, thank you very much. Your participation was very, very welcomed. Final thing for me to say is if I could just ask my panelists just to stay on for 60 seconds longer, and I will bid everybody farewell. Our next event is on the 30th of October, where we're tackling the topic of neurodivergence in the contact center. So it's going to be a really interesting discussion, and I've got hopefully some really great panelists lined up, just waiting for some to confirm. But please join me on the 30th of October, same time, 1 p.m. And the same place, LinkedIn Live. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in, and take care, and I'll speak to you all again later. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gary.
Bye.
Bye.